Well, we'll bring you the talk around the CBN's latest directive as regards Know Your Customer initiative as it relates to the Financial Action Task Force later on the show. But then in the interim, we want to quickly look at South Africa's GDP growth that is said to have declined. And according to reports, South Africa's economy contracted by 0.2% on a quarter-on-quarter and seasonally adjusted basis in the third quarter of 2023. Statistics South Africa said on Tuesday, sparking fears of an imminent recession. Now, 0.2% quarterly contraction in quarter three follows a slow growth of 0.5% in quarter two, a downward revision from the initial estimate of 0.6%. On an unadjusted annual basis, gross domestic product shrank by 0.7%, and this is far from a Reuters poll that had forecast smaller declines of 0.1% quarter-on-quarter and 0.2% year-on-year. The rand responded by falling in the space of an hour to 18.80 to a dollar from 18.75 to a dollar when the data was released earlier on in the year. Now, joining me from Potchefstroom, South Africa, is Professor Waldo Krugell. He's an economist, Northwest University, South Africa. Professor Krugell, thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Good morning, and thanks for the opportunity to speak to you.
Now, we have information on quarter-on-quarter and year-on-year GDP movement for South Africa. But then what is the exact GDP figure of the country based on the latest Q3 figure?
The GDP figures are the ones that we saw yesterday are these quarter-on-quarter numbers, seasonally adjusted. And we saw there that the economy contracted. I'm not exactly sure what the total rand amount would be. I suppose it's better to look at a dollar amount, but the level is less important than the direction that it's moving in. And very slow growth in the first two quarters and now a contraction in the third quarter is not good news for the South African economy.
Talking about contraction, Professor, some have said it is the chronic energy crisis and logistics nightmare that has taken a toll on the quarter three data. And this is also linked to supply chain disruptions due to the port crisis. I'd like you to help us paint a picture of the challenges being experienced in the ports and the energy crisis, including logistics and supply bottlenecks.
It's a grim picture, actually. When you read the media reporting on this, it's basically a problem of limited maintenance of equipment at the different ports that cause breakdowns, which then causes delays in loading and offloading of ships. And these delays have escalated to the point now where there are very serious delays with a great number of ships waiting outside Durban Harbour and a great number of trucks waiting outside the Richards Bay Harbour to be helped through the port infrastructure. So it's an operations problem, and it's possible to solve, but it's not something that's going to happen quickly. And these backlogs are going to take some time to clear. Added on top of that is when you have this intermittent electricity supply that causes further delays in operations at businesses and even at these major infrastructure hubs that just slows down economic activity to the extent that we now sit with, I think, what can reasonably be called a crisis.
Well, according to what we monitored, Professor Krugell, there was a temporary betterment in energy availability in the third quarter. And some people are saying that doesn't that count for anything? Because some economists are saying or have said that several other key high-frequency indices at the time already warned of a loss of economic momentum. So do you agree with that? What could these indices be? And when we have a little bit of improvement in power generation, don't you think that could, in a way, help beef up the economy in South Africa?
No, you're absolutely right. I think economists were not expecting the sort of numbers that came out yesterday, based on the fact that the energy availability improved in the third quarter, which leaves us worried about what's going to happen in the fourth quarter numbers when we had more load shedding. But that aside, I think the high frequency indicators, we already saw production and sales in manufacturing and mining contracting on a monthly basis in the third quarter. Consumer confidence has been very low. Business confidence has been low. Looking at purchasing managers' indices, Those also indicate that businesses are really concerned about the future of doing business over a 6-month term and a year's term. So all of those were already pointing to an economy that was struggling. And I think these third quarter numbers just came on top of what we already knew was going to be a tough quarter for the economy.
All right, so looking at what we have on screen there, we have a couple of these sectors that are said to be affected. And of course, with their low performance, it's resulting into poor economic indices for the country. Now, what do you think can be done in this regards to optimize these numbers? Is there any respite in sight, despite the fact that the country is grappling with so many challenges in these areas?
It's difficult to, I think some of them are going to respond to improved energy availability and slowly solving the crisis in the railways and the ports. In other cases, the problems are different. For example, the significant contraction of agriculture is less related to those problems than it is related to the cycle of planting and harvesting. So the third quarter is never a good quarter for field crops. But we also saw a big bird flu crisis in the poultry industry that dampened output there. So the long and the short is to engage in economic activity, you need to be able to have electricity. And particularly for the mines, they need to be able to move their product by rail. And then we need to be able to import and export through the ports. So whatever solutions are put on the table needs to address those problems first and foremost. And there are a number of plans in the pipeline, but I don't think any of them are going to make a difference in the next 2 weeks or the next month. It's going to take some time.
Well, you are expressing a bit of skepticism about what transformation or change can come to these sectors of the economy, but then the government is doing what it can to address these issues in bits. Well, not just in the power sector, but we also see the government trying to clear the backlog at the Richards Bay, Durban, and the Cape Town ports. Now, when should we expect a change in turnaround? So when should we expect maybe, even if it's going to be slightly, a change that we could witness? When do you think that will happen? What areas do you think the government can also still scale up its interventions to see maybe some growth or change or turning of the corner for the sectors of this economy can be realized?
I think of the two problems, the logistics problem and rail transport and harbors are going to be slightly easier to solve than the electricity crisis. Just because the electricity prices is such a long run and significantly huge problem to solve, many different things need to happen to address electricity availability. In the case of Transnet and the ports, I think there the problems are clearly operational. Transnet has received a government guarantee for some of their debts, but it's based on Transnet taking into account government's logistics performance plan and additional conditions that are not known yet. So I think that's the one place where the government is able to provide some financial relief, but in return for that, they can set a number of conditions and really monitor improvements as they go along. In a way, that it's also easier to draw in the private sector in the problems at the ports and on the railways, and there are initiatives for this going on. How fast it's happening is always the big question. That it's not happening fast enough.
Just as you expressed earlier that you are not too excited about a change in the economy, looking at the positivity that a lot of people are actually anticipating, including the government. This also ties to the contraction of the economy in the third quarter that is sparking fears now that there's a possibility of a looming technical recession. So do you also share the same sentiments? Do you think this will happen? Or do you think there could be a reverse depending on reactionary measures?
I think the possibility is there now. We know from fourth quarter numbers that are available that we already saw in the October numbers for manufacturing output and mining output, those numbers were down. We saw that construction confidence indices are down as well. We know that there hasn't really been much of a change for the consumer. The Reserve Bank has kept interest rates unchanged, which helps, but it doesn't provide relief yet. So I don't really expect the consumer to drive our economic growth in the fourth quarter, which basically leaves exports on the demand side of the economy as a driver of growth. And we know that the international economy is not growing that fast, which I think raises a real possibility that the economy could contract again in the fourth quarter. But we don't have November numbers yet, and obviously we don't have our December numbers. So I'm just worried about what would be the drivers of positive economic activity in this last bit of the year. I think many economists were expecting investment to remain strong in the third quarter as it did in the second, and that came down significantly. So I'm not sure that investment would be much different in the fourth quarter. So there's a real risk of a technical recession.
So how do we then now interpret the changes in household consumption, expenditure, and their potential implications for consumer confidence and, of course, spending habits?
Consumers are having a tough time, I suppose, as they are across the world. Everybody's facing a cost of living challenge from really high prices over the past 2 to 3 years. And added to that, interest rates have been high to fight that inflation. And there's not really been much relief in that way because consumers are not buying, businesses are also struggling, and they're not really paying high wage increases. They're not creating many new jobs. So in that sense, the relief for consumers will only come once interest rates start coming down, hopefully in the second half of 2024.
Well, earlier on, you talked about the need for collaborations with partners and different measures that you think that the government can employ in these various sectors. But then when we talk, I want you to break down these policy measures now, or the interventions that you expect the government to bring on board to stimulate economic activities and improve the overall economic outlook. In what areas, in what proportion, what are the policies? How do we drive the implementation of those policies in these sectors that are having negative indices?
I think the big challenge is that the reforms that need to happen are not based on government spending or taxes. So it's not really linked to the budget. It's regulatory changes that need to happen to draw in more private sector players into what used to be government-dominated industries like electricity and rail transport and the ports. So in that sense, everybody looks towards the Minister of Finance, but his hands are tied in terms of spending and taxes. The changes need to happen somewhere else, where the Minister of Public Enterprises, for example, needs to put in legislative changes that enables the private sector to participate in rail infrastructure or in port operations. And there are many of these plans already at different stages of implementation. But then in the South African case, you find these really difficult to understand, very long time lags that's difficult to explain why it takes such a long time. For example, in the ports case, there's sort of an agreement with a multinational consortium to help manage a specific part of Durban Harbour. And that agreement's been in place, but it's not signed and finalized. And it's been lying somewhere on government's table for the past 6 months. And that's really, I think, where economists' ability to explain what's happening ends, and it really becomes a different story of politics and management.
Well, Professor Krugell, just about an hour after these particular reports came out, we witnessed a fall in the value of the rand, 18.70%, 18.70 to a dollar, and we started to see that free fall in reaction to these negative reports. Is that going to continue? Is there anything that can be done to improve the value of the rand?
I think when the economy is struggling, you don't really expect the rand to be particularly strong. It's a measure of confidence in what's happening in the South African economy. And if the aggregate numbers are bad, that means that no one's really keen on investing in local companies through the JSE, and bondholders are worried about loaning more money to government, all those sorts of things that determine the demand for rands. But I think I should add that when these changes happened in the exchange rate, it was also a very strong day for the dollar. So it's not only rand weakness, to some extent, it's also dollar strength compared to other emerging market currencies. And I think the rand is going to be volatile to news like this for a while. Things are only going to start settling once the US Fed start cutting their interest rates. Then we'll see the rand stabilize. At what level, though, is a big question.
Well, we know that South Africa at one time is said to be the fastest growing economy in Africa, just as Nigeria is the largest economy in Africa. So when we see these vanguard economies in Africa begin to drop balls, what does it portend for other surrounding countries within these regions who are actually looking up or leaning towards these economies to spring up and to become better? Is there any future for them while we see South Africa and Nigeria struggle economically?
I think it just complicates the regional picture. If these powerhouses of the continent are struggling, they are also the main economies trading with other economies on the continent. So if South Africa, Nigeria is not growing fast, that also means that they're not trading as much as they can with their neighbors, which in return then limits their growth in really specific avenues. So it would be much better if both of these economies were doing well.
Well, definitely everyone is hoping that these economies will turn around the corner in no soonest time, most especially with the reforms and policies that we hope the government will bring on board to bring about that change. Professor Waldo Krugell, Economist, Northwest University, South Africa, thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome.